many of you remember the biggest government health tech disaster that took place on October 1st, 2013? One or two? And what was that? The rollout of healthcare.gov. I remember because I was at the White House at the time, and it wasn't our fault, but it quickly became our problem when, on the first day, only 6 people managed to enroll. And what we quickly realized, something we had known a little bit before, but what demonstrated from the president on down, is that we absolutely 100% need more technologists at the policy table. Policymakers shouldn't be making tech decisions, especially if we don't have technologists at the policy table. We knew this before because when Hurricane Sandy hit, we had a few technologists who were able to work with kids who were working on Twitter to be able to crowdsource which gas stations had fuel, which didn't, which was incredibly important to help survivors know where they can go. We were able to work with companies like Airbnb to expand housing so that we had access to 1,000 more rooms for survivors. And we had also created a program called the Presidential Innovation Fellows, where we brought in top technologists from across the country to be able to leverage their experience and work in government. They worked on great programs, like many of you may be familiar, like the Blue Button Initiative, which helped make more accessible your records and your health records in electronic format. We had other Presidential Innovation Fellows opening up data to make it more accessible to entrepreneurs and innovators like yourself. But as it turns out, technology and policy problems are actually much, much bigger. Do any of you care about climate change? Absolutely. Do you remember this? It wasn't an oil company, but it was a car company who used software to get around Clean Air Act regulations. Not only defrauding consumers, but defrauding the planet. And we saw other auto manufacturers doing similar things. How many people in Congress anticipated that? Anyone care about civil rights? Yeah? As it turns out, parole boards across the country are using software to help determine whether the likelihood of someone recommitting a crime. When they finally dug in to the algorithm to figure out if it was impacting or disadvantaging anyone, they found that it was systematically discriminating against African Americans. Anyone hear about this? The state of Michigan started to use software. I think they paid $30–40 million for this software to help automatically detect if people were committing unemployment insurance fraud, which is great. We don't want people committing unemployment insurance fraud. But as it turns out, when they did an audit 2 years later, they found that it had a 93% error rate. Garnishing wages from the very people that it was supposed to help, more than 20,000 people. Now, it's one thing if a company uses software and accidentally has discriminatory practices. It's another thing if the government is using software that is incarcerating people for a longer time or garnishing your wages automatically. Anyone make the switch from DVDs to Apple TVs? I did, and I loved it. But what we quickly found is that when you actually buy a product online, maybe a song on iTunes, maybe a book on Kindle, it turns out that you don't actually own it. if you owned it, you could be able to sell it. You could be able to rent it. That's why we had video stores around the country. But all of a sudden, when we went to digital, you no longer own the products that you're buying. Anyone looked at the terms of service on Tesla? As it turns out, if you're going to spend $100,000 on a car, and you put it in autonomous, when it goes fully autonomous, you cannot deploy it to any ride-sharing network. You can only deploy it to the Tesla network. So do you really own that car? Do you really have the options that you used to have as we go from analog to digital? What are our consumer rights? Anyone care about jobs in the economy? Autonomous vehicles could cost Americans 5 million jobs. What are we going to do about it? What are members of Congress going to help do to possibly create legislation that could allow for the Small Business Administration to provide loans for truck drivers to be able to upgrade their rigs so that they profit from automation? They don't lose their jobs to automation. Anyone get impacted by the Equifax hack? I did. My information was also hacked as part of the government hack that China did with my fingerprints and everything. But as it turns out, $14 billion in annual physical theft, $24 billion in annual identity theft. And that's the problem you're probably thinking about when our data was hacked with Equifax. But you guys probably put a lot more time thinking about how you protect your physical things than you do your identity. But here's the problem that people aren't talking about. Does anyone care about our democracy? According to a Harvard study, as well as the Equifax data breach and others, you can now change people's voter registrations in more than 35 states. The election can now be hacked, and they've actually seen experiments from foreign governments who have done trials on this already. I assume you guys care about healthcare tech? According to one study, the lack of healthcare record interoperability is costing 150,000 lives and $18.6 billion. When I was running the research lab for Bitcoin and blockchain at MIT, we worked on an effort to use the blockchain to help make medical records open and interoperable so that you, as the patient, can have control of your records, control of who has access to them, be able to pull back that as well, which is incredibly important. But we also need legislators in Congress to ensure that the several software companies who are running electronic medical record software are actually making sure that they're interoperable so that people aren't dying as a result. What we have today, we used to have just the computer guy or the computer gal. Then we had the webmaster. Then we had the app guy or the app gal. We need an app for that. But today, we've got more than 15 different emerging technologies that are changing the way that we have to think about regulations, that are changing the way that we're thinking about our business models, from drones to CRISPR to blockchain to artificial intelligence and autonomous vehicles. And we need different individuals who are thinking about that. And when you think about it, the average age of leadership in Congress is 72 years old. Less than 4% of people in Congress have a technical background. How are they going to be able to think, create laws that enable entrepreneurs and innovators to be able to build the successful companies without understanding the technology? How are they going to be able to protect consumer safety and consumer rights without understanding the technology? And you know what? This is bipartisan. I happen to be a Democrat, and I worked in the Obama White House, but one of the things that I learned was that on the right and the left, they can both agree on how we can use technology to improve government and to create more jobs. In fact, the very last bill that was signed into law happened on the day of inauguration, the day Trump was inaugurated. I remember it because I got a frantic call from a friend. He said, Brian, is there anyone left in the West Wing? I said, I can try and see if there's someone there. He said, because Paul Ryan's staff can't get a hold of the president's staff, and there's a final bill to be signed. I said, wow, that sounds important. Called a few friends. It turns out there was actually one person left in the West Wing. And I called her, and she said, I don't think this is happening. We have some important things to do. But as it turns out, their staffs were able to communicate. And as the President Obama went to the Capitol, they actually pulled him aside in a room, and they signed that last bill. And that bill was to enshrine into law the Presidential Innovation Fellowship Program, to ensure that going forward, we always have our top technologists in government at the policy table. This has bipartisan appeal. And so I'd love to stay in touch with you. I'd love to continue having this conversation. I'd love to learn from you about what you think needs to happen in government, what legislation you think needs to happen to allow for your companies and your innovations to be able to grow in America, and I want to help make that happen. So please send me an email. I'd love to stay in touch, and I'd love to take some questions and answers.
Thank you, Brian. I'll please come up with questions and hopefully answers. I'm going to ask you one.
Sure.
I found out last fall that there's exactly one PhD in Congress, right? Bill Foster.
That's right.
And who knew healthcare was complex? And you've taken up the mantle not to just talk about this, but do something about it. And you've decided to run for Congress. Tell me a little bit about why and what you want to accomplish.
Sure. So there's a couple things. One, I'm clearly not in favor of the way that Donald Trump is taking this country. But I think even more importantly than that, we need to make sure that we do have more technologists in Congress. This is something that I learned innately working in the White House. And when I learned that less than 4% of people in Congress had a technical background, I was floored. I mean, when I was running the research lab for Bitcoin and blockchain at MIT, I would get calls from members of Congress, and I would go there, and I would meet with them, meet with senators, and describe to them how they could use this technology. They're actually very curious about it. They want to know how they could use blockchain for voting, especially to help our members of the military abroad who want to be able to cast their ballots and do it in a potentially electronic way. And so they're curious, but they don't have the knowledge to be able to really go deep on the topic and create the legislation that has a real impact. And what one senator told me is he was actually just calling me for unsolicited advice on blockchain and voting. And he said, he actually didn't realize I was running for Congress. And I said, well, I'm going to announce in a few weeks. And he said, look, this is going to be incredibly powerful. You would play an incredibly powerful role in Congress. He said there's two types of people in Congress. There's the ones that have the chits and they're kind of greasing the wheels and making the deals. He said then there's the experts. He said because when you walk into a room, there will be no person at the table that will be able to snowblow you on anything that's related to technology because they know that you'll embarrass them. And none of them want to be embarrassed. And so we need people like you. We need more technologists in Congress, more scientists in Congress to make sure that we're making the right decisions and that we continue to remain a leader in the world on tech and innovation and science.
And because what Congress, the Senate, the White House does, and the U.S. and little systems around the world really is a lever, along with technology, to make things change.
Yep.
And it can also impede progress as well.
Without
What may
doubt.
be a couple specific initiatives? Hopefully, you're elected, and you'd want to get in the next stages of policy.
Sure. I think there's a couple of things. One of the biggest challenges with actually figuring out that African Americans are being systematically discriminated against via private company software that was being used is that we could not use the Freedom of Information Act to actually access that algorithm because they said it was proprietary. And so what we have to figure out are responsible ways as we see software and we see artificial intelligence being used across the board in every single industry, making decisions on everyone's life. We have to figure out to what extent does the consumer have the right to know and the public have a right to know how those decisions are being impacted. Because if you think about it, if one applies for credit and they get denied, what right do you have? You have the right to get your credit report and make sure that there are no errors on there. And if there are errors, you can go there and correct them. So going forward, as software continues to make more and more decisions and impacts our life, from healthcare to sorting out candidates for jobs, to whether you're paroled or whether you're deemed, whether you committed unemployment insurance or fraud or not, and it's incorrect, we have to have the right as a society to know that everything was done correctly and that everyone has a fair shot.
Great. Well, thanks for giving folks a fair shot. Pull up the last slide. I think it's really important that we have folks like you, like Hans Kierstead, who we had the other day, two amazing technologist scientists running for Congress, both in Orange County.
That's right.
In red districts that
That's right.
Some of us think could be flipped and need to be flipped. So you can find Brian on Twitter at Forde.com and hopefully support him and his campaign going forward and bring folks in your countries and communities who are technologists and scientists and clinicians into the higher levels of power to help catalyze exponential technologies in healthcare and beyond. With that, thanks, Brian Forde.
Hey, thank you so much.
Thanks.